Ever think about, like, how we hold this book, this Bible, as something so sacred, so central to our faith? But what if I told you it started in a world without, actual books?
It's mind-blowing when you actually stop and consider it.
Right, and that's exactly what we're diving into today, this whole journey of how the Bible went from whispers to, well, the written word.
It's a fascinating story.
Totally. And thankfully, we've got Jimmy Akin's book, The Bible is a Catholic Book, to be our roadmap.
It's an invaluable resource, that's for sure.
Okay, so imagine a world where everything, important stories, laws, beliefs, are passed down through generations by word of mouth. It's wild, right?
It's more than just wild. It's incredible to think about how integral the spoken word was for millennia. All of human history, really, before the written word became so dominant. It was about preserving a legacy through storytelling, through memorization, through this almost sacred act of passing down knowledge from one generation to the next.
It's like that game of telephone we played as kids, but with, like, the weight of an entire culture riding on it.
Exactly. And it wasn't just any stories either, right? These were narratives imbued with meaning, with history, with the very essence of who they were as a people.
And this wasn't just, for lack of better technology. Canon points out that even when writing did emerge, it wasn't like everyone just switched over immediately. Like, think about Abraham.
Right, the covenant with God. That wasn't about signing on a dotted line.
Exactly. It was this incredibly personal, spoken promise, this binding agreement based on trust and something much, much deeper than a written contract.
It speaks to the power of the spoken word to create a bond, a sacred connection that transcended the need for, well, a physical record. It wasn't just information being conveyed, it was a relationship being forged.
And that relationship, that reliance on oral tradition, it wasn't just out of convenience, it was the lifeblood of their culture. Akin even talks about how the word hieroglyphs comes from the Greek for sacred carving.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and apparently these carvings were often handled by priests. It's like even when writing emerged, it was seen as something, I don't know, almost magical, sacred.
It makes sense, though.
Yeah.
If the spoken word held such power, then the act of writing, especially about sacred things, must have seemed like an extension of that power.
Totally. Which makes me think about the first time writing actually shows up in the Bible, the book of Exodus.
Moses and the Ten Commandments. Pretty significant moment.
Right. God instructs Moses to write things down, and suddenly, boom, there's this shift. We're moving from the spoken word to this written testament, a tangible record of the covenant.
It's like a whole new chapter in the story of, well, the story itself.
Exactly. And here's where it gets really interesting, at least according to Akin. He suggests that the first parts of the Bible written down might not have been Genesis, as many assume.
Wait, really?
Yeah! He thinks it could have been Job or even some of the prophets, like Isaiah, that were written down first. And Genesis, even though it talks about the beginning, might have existed as oral history way before anything was written down.
So, trying to pinpoint the absolute first written word of the Bible, it's like trying to find the exact spot a river begins. Sure, you can follow it to its source, but what about all the little streams and tributaries that feed into it?
I love that analogy. It's so true. But even if we can't pinpoint the exact source, the river keeps flowing, right? Languages evolve, cultures change, and even holy scriptures need updating.
Absolutely. I mean, imagine being in a synagogue during Jesus' time. They're reading from the Torah, but it's in Hebrew. But everyone's everyday language is Aramaic.
So they need a translator.
Exactly. And those translations, those Aramaic versions of the scriptures were called targums.
Huh. It's kind of like how we have so many different versions of the Bible today, right?
Precisely. Different translations, different interpretations. It's all part of that ongoing conversation of making these sacred texts accessible to people.
It reminds me of something else fascinating Akin brought up. Alexander the Great.
Ah, yes. His empire, it stretched all across the Mediterranean, spreading the Greek language far and wide, which explains why the New Testament we read wasn't in the classical Greek of, like, Plato and Socrates.
But in Koine Greek.
Exactly. The common language of the everyday people. It was the language of the marketplace, the language of the streets. It's amazing how even back then, the Bible was meant to meet people where they were, linguistically and culturally.
It's like they weren't trying to make it this exclusive club. They wanted everyone to have access to these stories.
Precisely. And we have to remember, this was a time of incredible cultural and religious diversity, even within Judaism itself. You had Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes, all these different groups, each with their own take on the law, their own interpretations, their own traditions.
So how do you even begin to decide what is scripture in all of that?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? That idea of forming a canon, as Akin puts it, it wasn't a simple process, that's for sure.
No kidding. And this is where things get really interesting, because even back then, there wasn't always a clear consensus on which books were considered, divinely inspired.
And that debate, my friend, that's a deep dive for another time.
So we've got these sacred texts starting to emerge, this whole idea of a written testament.
Right, but then enters Jesus, and everything changes.
It's like he doesn't just embody the word, he challenges our whole understanding of it.
Absolutely. What's fascinating is how Jesus actually interacts with the scriptures of his time.
It's not like he treats them as these untouchable pronouncements.
No, not at all. He engages with them as living, breathing words that point to something deeper, something beyond the literal interpretation.
Akin even uses this phrase, "You have heard it said, but I say to you."
Oh, that's a good one. It's like he's saying, okay, you've learned the rules, now let me show you the heart of the matter.
It's like he's holding up a prism to those ancient texts, revealing all these hidden colors and dimensions.
Exactly. Like, remember that whole debate about ritual purity, like washing your hands meticulously before meals?
Oh yeah, like it was all about outward actions, following the letter of the law.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Jesus, he flips the script. He's like, what comes out of a man is what defiles a man. He shifts the focus from these external rituals to the internal state of our hearts.
It's a totally radical shift, and it actually connects back to what we were saying earlier about oral tradition.
Oh, how so?
Well, think about it. Jesus, like those ancient storytellers, he's using his words not just to convey information, but to reveal a deeper truth, to transform our understanding from the inside out.
That's a really interesting connection. It makes you wonder then, what did Jesus actually consider scripture?
Right, because during his time, there were already different opinions on which books belonged in the Jewish canon.
Which is something we still see today. I mean, some Bibles have extra books, others don't.
Exactly. It's not as simple as saying, here's the Bible, end of story. It's always been a bit more, complicated.
Akin even points out that the Sadducees, remember them?
Yeah, they were like this prominent Jewish group back then, right?
Exactly. Well, they didn't even accept the book of Daniel as scripture.
Really?
Yeah, but then Jesus, when he's talking about the end times, he quotes directly from Daniel.
So he's kind of subtly validating a book that some considered questionable.
Right. It's like this subtle nod, this hint that Jesus' understanding of Scripture was maybe a bit more, shall we say, inclusive than some might have imagined.
It makes you realize that this whole idea of figuring out the canon, of deciding which books were divinely inspired, it's a question that has lingered for centuries.
Speaking of which, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the early church.
Yeah.
Talk about a challenge. They had to figure out how to transmit the teachings of Jesus.
And not just his words, right, but his entire message, his whole vibe, to a world that was, kind of desperate for meaning.
Absolutely. And let's not forget, they couldn't just send out a mass email or post a video on YouTube.
They were stuck with the old school methods of communication.
Exactly. Storytelling, preaching, and of course the written word, slowly but surely starting to play a more prominent role.
But like oral tradition, it's all romantic and poetic until you realize how tricky it can be to keep things consistent across different communities, languages, cultures.
That's where Paul's letters come in. It's like getting a glimpse into the early church in real time, wrestling with these exact issues.
It's true. And to think, those letters, which we now hold as sacred scripture, they were originally just one tool among many that the early Christians used.
It's wild when you think about it like that. They were written to address very specific situations, to answer questions, to offer guidance, almost like spiritual advice columns, in a way.
And they weren't cheap to produce either.
No kidding. Imagine the effort it took. Writing on papyrus, finding a scribe, sending a messenger. These were precious commodities, these letters.
They were literally worth their weight in papyrus.
Exactly. And it highlights how they weren't trying to create some grand, overarching theological system. They were responding to the immediate needs of a community that was, let's face it, figuring things out as they went along.
Making it up as they went along.
In a way, yes. And as they responded, they wove together those oral traditions, personal experiences, and yes, even those written texts into this incredibly rich tapestry of belief that, over time, would come to define Christianity as we know it.
And somewhere within that tapestry, we have the Gospels taking shape. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. each telling the story of Jesus, but in their own unique way.
It's like having 4 different perspectives on the same event.
Exactly. And what's remarkable is that these accounts, written by different authors in different places at different times, they somehow came together to become, the cornerstone of Christian faith.
Which makes you wonder, how did these individual accounts gain such authority? How did they rise above all the other writings circulating at the time?
Well, it's important to remember that the Gospels weren't anonymous. They weren't just these random scrolls that appeared out of thin air.
They were written within communities that knew the authors, understood their context, their intentions.
Exactly. It's not like these manuscripts just magically materialized with no historical grounding.
Luke even addresses his gospel to a specific person, Theophilus. John is identified as, and I love this, the disciple whom Jesus loved. These aren't just disembodied voices. These are real people writing to real people about things that actually happened.
It makes the Gospels feel so much more immediate, more personal, don't you think?
Absolutely. And it's important to remember their purpose, it wasn't necessarily to create 4 separate biographies of Jesus. I think it was more about offering different lenses, different perspectives through which to view his life, his teachings, his impact.
Akin even talks about how the Gospels build upon each other, like movements in a symphony.
I love that analogy. He even cites Papias, this early church figure, who claimed that Mark's gospel was actually the first one written based on Peter's preaching. Then you have Matthew and Luke, who use Mark as a source, expanding on his account, adding their own unique details and insights.
It's like they each had a piece of the puzzle, and together they formed a more complete picture.
And then you have John's gospel. Written later, it intentionally weaves its narrative into the structure of Mark, almost like a spiritual commentary on that earlier gospel.
It's like John saying, okay, you've heard the story, now let me show you what it really means.
Exactly. So it's not about choosing one gospel over another. It's about appreciating how they work together, how they harmonize, to reveal the richness and complexity of Jesus.
And we can't forget, these texts were written decades after the events they describe. The early church had time to reflect, to debate, to allow these stories to mature within their collective memory.
It's like the difference between, say, a news flash and a well-researched biography. Both have their place, but the biography, it offers this depth and perspective that only time and careful consideration can provide.
Exactly. Which leads us to a pretty crucial question. How did these texts, along with Paul's letters, become recognized as scripture? How did the church decide what belonged in this canon and what didn't?
Yes, the million-dollar question. It's a fascinating part of the story, that's for sure.
So we left off with this big question. How did the early church decide what made it into the New Testament? Like, what made these particular writings worthy of being called scripture?
It's a question that, a lot of people don't even think to ask, but it's crucial.
Right, because it's not like they had this nice, neat list handed down to them.
Exactly. It was a process, a journey of discernment.
It's like those art experts trying to figure out if a painting is the real deal or a fake.
I like that analogy. Asian uses this term tradition, but with a capital T, to describe this process.
Not just any old tradition, right? But the core teachings, the beliefs, the practices that were passed down from the apostles themselves.
The DNA of the early church, you could say. And just like those art experts, they had criteria. They had standards.
So what were they looking for? What made a text worthy of being included in the canon?
Well, for starters, who wrote it? Was it an apostle or someone closely connected to them? Like, did it have that direct line back to Jesus?
Makes sense. You want to make sure it's the real deal, not some fan fiction.
Exactly. And it wasn't enough for it to just be, a good story. It had to be widely accepted by Christian communities.
Yeah.
Like, was this something that resonated with believers across different regions, different backgrounds?
It had to have that universal appeal, that ring of truth that transcended cultural differences.
Exactly. And most importantly, did it align with the overall message of the gospel?
Did it fit within the larger narrative of who Jesus was, what he taught, what he embodied?
Exactly. These weren't just arbitrary rules they came up with. They were safeguards.
To protect the integrity of their faith.
Precisely. To make sure that the texts that ultimately shaped Christian belief were authentic and trustworthy.
It's like building a house, right? You wouldn't just use any old materials. You'd want to make sure they're strong, durable, able to withstand the test of time.
And just like building a house takes time, so too did this process of forming the canon. It wasn't some overnight decision. It unfolded gradually over centuries.
It was organic, evolving.
Exactly. Aiken gives some interesting examples like the Didache, which was this early church manual, and the Shepherd of Hermas. Valuable writings for sure, but they didn't quite make the cut for the official canon.
They didn't have the right stuff.
Exactly. And then, of course, you had those who were intentionally trying to muddy the waters.
They're heretics.
Exactly. Trying to hijack the narrative, push their own agendas. Aiken talks about Marcion, who had this whole edited version of the Bible that tried to erase any trace of Jewish influence.
Talk about a hostile takeover. So, with all this back and forth, how did the early church finally say, okay, these are the 27 books of the New Testament, we're done here?
Well, it was a combination of things. Local councils, pronouncements from popes, centuries of prayer and debate and discernment.
Wow, it really makes you appreciate the weight of tradition.
It wasn't until 382 AD that Pope Damasus made that official declaration.
Oh.
These and only these books belong in the New Testament.
Centuries in the making, and even with all that, you still had brilliant minds, like St. Jerome, the guy who translated the Bible into Latin, the Vulgate, wrestling with some of these questions.
Yes, Jerome and the deuterocanonical books, those books that some Bibles include in a separate section.
Like Tobit, Judith, Maccabees.
Exactly. He wasn't so sure about those.
Why not? What was the issue?
Well, he'd been influenced by some Jewish scholars who didn't consider those books part of their Hebrew Bible.
So he was like, if they don't accept them, maybe we shouldn't either.
Something like that. But here's the key takeaway, and it's one that Aiken really emphasizes. Jerome ultimately deferred to the judgment of the church.
He recognized that this collective wisdom, this tradition, held a weight even greater than his own individual scholarship.
And that's a powerful lesson, isn't it? That none of us has all the answers. We rely on the wisdom of those who came before us.
We're part of something much bigger than ourselves.
Exactly. And speaking of something bigger, enter Gutenberg and his printing press. Talk about a game changer.
Right. Suddenly, Bibles are more accessible than ever before. The word is spreading like wildfire.
A revolution. But like any revolution, it came with its share of, shall we say, growing pains?
Cue the Reformation. Martin Luther steps onto the stage, and suddenly it's all about sola scriptura, scripture alone, as the ultimate authority.
And here's the irony that Aiken points out. Sola scriptura only makes sense in a world where everyone has access to their own personal Bible, thanks to the printing press. Before that, it wasn't even a question.
It's like saying everyone should build their own cars from scratch before the invention of factories and assembly lines.
Exactly. Even Luther himself had issues with parts of the New Testament.
He did.
Oh yeah, he called the book of James an epistle of straw because it didn't fit with his theology.
He was just tossing books out left and right.
Well, not quite, but it highlights how this idea of a single, unified Protestant Bible that came much, much later. It wasn't this immediate clean break from the Catholic Church.
So what are we saying then? That the Catholic Church is the real MVP when it comes to the Bible?
I wouldn't say MVP necessarily, but they did play a crucial role.
Right, preserving the full canon, transmitting those ancient traditions, offering guidance on how to interpret these sacred texts.
They were, and continue to be, guardians of that legacy.
Wow, what an incredible journey we've taken. We started with those ancient stories being whispered around campfires, passed down through generations, and now, here we are, thousands of years later, still grappling with those same stories, those same questions, those same longings.
It's a testament to the enduring power of these texts, isn't it? That they continue to speak to us across time and cultures, challenging us, comforting us, inspiring us.
It's amazing to think that the Bible we hold in our hands today, this book that has shaped civilizations, sparked movements, ignited countless debates, it all started with a whisper.
And maybe, just maybe, that whisper is still echoing within each of us, urging us to listen a little deeper, to seek a little harder, and to never stop wrestling with those big questions that lie at the very heart of what it means to be human.